Hello everybody, and welcome again to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, indeed the first edition of 2014. 2014 offers to be a very, very busy year for this show because we've already got, I think, at the last count, 8 guests for the 12 months, and some of them are going to be really, really interesting individuals from across the world. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I'm particularly looking forward to this show because unlike our previous shows, what we're going to be doing here is having a general discussion and a round-robin a general discussion about the life and work of Philip K. Dick, and also one or two other interesting topics that might actually stimulate you guys to think about a lot of issues yourselves. The person that I'm involved with today is a very good friend of mine by the name of Nick Buchanan. Now, Nick and I both hail from the same part of the UK, and I'm reminded, and Nick may know of this story, but I'm reminded of the very, very famous Cheshire prophet called Nixon. And Nixon lived in late medieval times during the reign of Henry VII, and he was known for his knowledge of future events. And one of the things that he was asked was, if the end of the world ever took place, where would be the place to avoid Armageddon? And he suggested that the best place to be would be God's Holy Croft twixt Mersey and Dee. Now, God's Holy Croft twixt Mersey and Dee is in fact a place called the Wirral. And the Wirral is a peninsula that's located between North Wales on one side and Liverpool on the other. And although we consider ourselves to be what his local term is Scousers, effectively we have our own unique worldview, which is the Wirralian worldview. Now, I first met Nick many years ago when we were setting up something called the Walker Group meetings. And the Walker Group meetings were, and still are, a group of individuals that meet up usually every fortnight to discuss issues vaguely related to my work, but basically to do with anything to do with that's esoteric, philosophical, or basically to do with the nature of consciousness and its relationship with reality. And we had some fascinating discussions in the past, and I know these still continue to this day. And indeed, if anybody's interested in checking this out, if you go onto Facebook and just put in ITLAD Walker Group, that's ITLAD, ITLAD Walker Group, and just join in with the guys. I know that Nick is heavily involved with this group, as are quite a few other people that have been involved in my work and indeed their own work for quite a long time. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody to Nick. Hi, Nick.
Hi there.
Hi. Right, what I'd like to do is to open up, one of the things that we found we had in common, there are many things you and I have got in common, including a great need for understanding and a great thirst for knowledge. But one of the major things we had in common was Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. And I think one of the things I've never asked you is how you became interested in Philip K. Dick's work. How long ago was it, and how did it develop?
It was a long time ago now. It was about 1976 when I first bumped into his work. I remember we had a school library in the sixth form, and I was in the sixth form then, a secondary school, and we had a lot of very, very old books, which were mainly either about Biggles or Tudors and Stuarts. And I was having a thirst for some books that were broader and wider, and literally thumbing through in a W.H. Smith's off the shelf, I found a novel. It was actually a Martian Time Slip, which has the one with Manfred, the autistic boy, and the shifts in time, and became fascinated because in school we were given so much fare that was not really connecting with me, and this certainly did, and I found it was incredible. And then I continued to read more and more, and found a great kind of vast treasure of stuff. It was a rich seam to mine, and even today I'm staggered by the breadth of Phil's approach from 50s kind of pulp fiction right the way through to very esoteric novels at the very end of his life.
It's intriguing, Nick, isn't it, that for somebody presumably at 16, 17, possibly 18,
Yeah.
you're in a position to appreciate in many ways the subtleties of Martian time slip, because I would say that, it's not standard, it is standard science fiction, isn't it, in the sense that it's based on Mars and you have the colonists and everything else. But it deals with some very, very deeply significant subjects about the nature of reality, and indeed autism, and or as Phil would term it at the time, schizophrenia as well. So did you pick up those nuances at that time, or is it something that only later on you've become to appreciate?
I think the interesting thing about that observation is that what's happened for me usually with things that prove very significant later on is that when they first present themselves, I don't always know why they're significant, but I feel a strong intuition that they are important. So a book like Martian Time Slip would be richer with each return and each new read. What tended to happen in those days with me as a 16-year-old is that I think I've always been like a boy who, like a child collects a marble and an elastic band and something else, a bubblegum card. And from the child's point of view, you know that they mean something to you, and you never feel the need to justify or explain those things. And I collect those things, and I always have collected those things. And I'm not interested in waiting for a consensus or some ratification from elsewhere. If it means something to me, then I collect that, and that means that often I go off in different tangents, happily excavating away to my own amusement and enjoyment and hopefully edification. But with Phil, it's been Phil has paid dividends, as it were. He's so worthwhile in terms of his thought, and I confess, even though people regard me as knowing quite a bit about Phil, it's really his ideas that fascinate me the most. It's the directions he nudges me into to consider, and the paradoxes and conundrums that he sets up through various means, obviously through things like precognition or parallel universes, or what if the human could be decanted into another thing, be it a spaceship or whatever. He did that in a story called Mr. Spaceship, by the way. They lead to fascinating strands of inquiry, and I love him for that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I know, and if anybody's interested, and we'll discuss this later, is that Nick is very much involved as the graphic designer of a magazine called PKD Otaku, and Nick has interviewed me twice in that particular magazine, and there's areas we discussed within the interview which was about our respective interests. Growing up on the Wirral in terms of science fiction and such like. And I remember when I first got into science fiction, and do you know what was really weird? Is that I was always intrigued. When we were kids, I don't know if you used to do this, Nick, but whenever you used to watch American TV programs, at the end, now I'm older than you, but effectively you probably still remember similar programs such as Wagon Train and The Fugitive and various other programs, is the strangeness of American names. You know, we're all very boring over here. We all have very, very boring names. But I remember, for instance, you know, when I was a kid, you see names like Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and you'd go, wow, these names are really outrageously weird and sort of so interesting. And when I got into science fiction, I remember particularly noticing the names. The names still resonate with me. And it's off the top of my head now because I've done no research on this, but I remember like Paul Anderson and why on earth he spelt his name the way he did. And then you have Isaac Asimov, and then you have people like Thomas Disch and various other individuals. And all these names were very, very strange. And, of course, Philip K. Dick as well. Within those groups, I associate these names very powerfully together. Now, was Philip K. Dick your first introduction to science fiction, or were you rather like me? You came through the route of Marvel comics and DC comics, and you got into science fiction in that route. I mean, effectively, you know, I remember the very first science fiction book I read, and, I can't remember who wrote it now. It was a fairly obscure individual, I think. But I remember that was the very first book I'd read that was a proper book with words that actually had, it was bound, and it was a real book that wasn't a textbook. And I felt very proud thinking, so this is the first grown-up book I've read when I was about 9 or 10. So what was your first science fiction book that you read, and how did you move on, or was it Phil?
Well, interestingly enough, I remember it clearly, it wasn't Phil. Sorry, Phil. I feel promiscuous now. It was actually Isaac Asimov. My uncle used to work in a bookshop in Church Alley in Liverpool, which was the little road facing the beautiful Georgian building. I had the luxury of an uncle who could get me a 20% discount of the books I wanted, and we're quite a poor family, really. Family of 5, mum widowed when I was 10, and I remember being in that shop, and there was a book on the shelf of Isaac Asimov, which was the first one in the Foundation trilogy, and there was a lovely Chris Foss painting on the front, which you'll be familiar with, that he used to do these big pieces of space hardware in these great skies with starburst effects and lens flare. And it was really the tail end of the space opera era, which E. Doc Smith introduced with his Lensman series a long, long time ago. And it's interesting you pick up on the names, because it was the name Asimov. This sounded so other that I had to investigate, and it was in big bold type on the front, all lowercase, so it was quite radical. And I wasn't disappointed. That I was younger then. I must have been about 13, maybe 12, I don't know, and that engaged me. I recently reread it just to see the childhood treasures from a different angle, and it didn't really engage me at all. And I think I've been spoilt with the likes of Philip K. Dick. Another exotic name, which we can add to our list, I think both of us, is Roger Zelazny. There are so many of these people: Robert Sheckley, Robert Zelazny, Ian Watson, Harlan Ellison, Philip K. Dick, of course. So I think I'd approached science fiction from pure science hardware, and I think the Foundation trilogy are based upon the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the Gibbons book, quite closely anyway. But I prefer this iRobot series, Asimov, but once I got to Philip K. Dick, all bets were off, because there was these speculations about time and about identity and about what it means to be human, and a notion that reality is in the habit of concealing itself. And that really interested me. I think we're born philosophers, I think. We begin by asking a lot of questions about why is the sky blue, why is the grass green, and somewhere between the primary and the secondary schools these tend to evaporate, and answers are of a much higher premium than questions. But I still enjoy the questions with Phil.
That's one of the things, again, there's another name you mentioned there that probably got me thinking about the nature of selfhood more than anybody else until I started rereading Phil again when I got older, was the Robert Sheckley novel Mind Swap, if you remembered it at all. And the sense is that Robert Sheckley was a humorist as well, and unlike a lot of science fiction, which can be extremely po-faced in its approach, Sheckley had a wonderful sense of the ridiculous. And I think probably to my young mind, Sheckley was very, very effectively funny. However, it was only as I became older and supposedly more sophisticated that I could also see the humour in Philip K. Dick, and almost the self-depreciation that Philip K. Dick puts in his novels.
Yeah.
Now, you and I have discussed this many, many times about the way in which people very much focus in on Phil's later novels as being of profound importance, the Valis, the novels based around the Valis experiences and such like in 2374. But I think we both agree that Phil was writing very, very deeply philosophical novels, at a very early age. I mean, it wasn't as if it was something he developed over the years. He was playing with these ideas early on. And I was wondering, I know you know the short stories far better than I do. And I was wondering if there's any kind of highlighting short stories that you feel really highlight this. I mean, I'm reminded, is it What She Wanted, in terms of, creating your own reality and everything else. And we know that Phil had this interest in the idea of the inner reality and the outer reality. And I wonder whether you could just touch a little bit about Phil's philosophy on that, how he put it into his writing, and then we could move on possibly to the whole concept of the koinos cosmos and the idios cosmos for the listeners as well, to understand this powerful Gnostic text that runs through most of Philip's writing.
Sure. I mean, first of all, if I could just pick up on the humour, because I think that's well worth championing, and then I'll touch on a short story as a sample that would illustrate a lot of Phil's speculations. With regard to the humour, that's always been one of the things that attracts me to Phil, and I don't think it's championed enough. I think there's a great scene in A Scanner Darkly, where the guy has obviously got a drug problem, and there's this whole scene which is worthy of Pinter or Beckett, where he imagines he's got a younger brother who is a giant aphid. The guy sees aphids everywhere, and to his great dismay, his family appear to prefer this aphid, and they're complimenting the aphid at the breakfast table or the tea table, and he's getting more and more perturbed by the fact that his own parents prefer a giant aphid to himself. They're just delightful sources of absurdist comedy. Another one is in, I think it's in Galactic Pot Healer, where the guy Joe Fernwright has a dream at night. And he has a dream that he's actually a designer for the Royal Mint of the place where he is. And he's designed these coins, and he's been told that his face will appear on the coin as a tribute to his great design. And in the dream, it turns out when he meets the king of this land, there's been a misunderstanding, and his face will now not appear. And he's very disappointed again. Phil's good at the disappointments of life, but at the same time, you then realise in the book that there is some kind of dream device that the populace have to subscribe to. So it turns out that everybody that night has had a dream where they are the coin makers, and they all wake up very disappointed as a collective. So I think Phil's humour is well worth championing. In terms of a short story, yes, I do love the short stories, and I think one thing I think that makes them overlooked is that there is a phenomenon, I think, where people fail to see art unless it has a frame around it and is in a gallery. And once it's been flagged up as art, they will then see it as art. Indeed, they'll go in droves to see the Mona Lisa because they've been told of its worthiness. And they can fail to see art around them in nature, in people, in more humble, prosaic situations. And I think equally, a frame has been put around Phil's later work as being esoteric, philosophical, and worthy, as if the early stuff was somehow some discontinuity and some other voice from some other person. But like you, I see a great continuity, and some of the early stories are incredibly profound. And I mean, he wrote short stories right the way through. The later ones too are profound. The one that popped into my head of all his canon when you mentioned the short stories was The Electric Ant. For the benefit of folks who perhaps don't know anything about Phil and would like to know what we're talking about, The Electric Ant is a story of a guy who wakes up in a hospital. His name is Garson Poole. It's just popped into my head the way these things do. And when he wakes up, he's very distressed by the fact that one of his hands is missing. and he wants information and he wants to find out what's going on. And when he speaks to the doctors and the medics, they break it to him gently that he's actually an artificial being, that he's not actually human. And again, there's an absurdist drama played out about his disappointment, his slight disappointment at finding out such a thing. And he discovers that in his chest there is a kind of, it looks like an old computer ticker tape machine where they have punched holes, and there's a reader that reads the code. And this moves very, very slowly, and he observes it. So he can see the configuration of perforations that are about to enter into the reed head. And he decides that what he'll do as an experiment is he'll tape over some of the holes, and he'll punch new holes as well in places where there aren't holes. So he goes ahead and does this, and he sits and waits. And as the bit he's altered passes over the reader head, a flock of geese fly through his room, right through one wall and through the other. And of course the questions that raises about consciousness and about, do we generate consciousness? Does it come from us? Or is it actually something out there? Indeed, it raises all kinds of questions about ourselves, I think, in terms of memory. Is memory located within us? Is it something that happens to us? Is there really an akashic field or something similar where everything is located? Where is mind? I speak of mind not as the brain, but where is mind? And then the interface between brain and mind and consciousness and our somatic experience at the moment. All of these questions are profound, and that's just a little bit from a Phil Dick short story, and it raises issues, I think, to do with what you wanted to discuss soon, to do with the idios cosmos and the koinos cosmos.
It does indeed. I mean, one of the electric ants, I think it was you that probably introduced me to that, because that was a gem I'd missed when I was reading through Philip K. Dick, many, many years ago. Now, interestingly enough, you're probably aware that Marvel Comics, around about 4 or 5 years ago, brought out a graphic novel which was based upon the short story as well, and the artist in question, the guy behind it, I have actually been in contact with. Unfortunately, his name is escaping me at the moment, which is rather sad, so my apologies to him. But effectively, he very much shows how Philip K. Dick's work can be generated in a graphic way. And of course, because graphic novels can really play with the idea of reality in a probably even more powerful way than indeed the movies can. And I think he does a fantastic job of this, because it does bring down the basic question that I think played throughout Phil's life. And as you and I know, towards the last few years of his life, he was writing this extensive, initially handwritten and then typed narrative, which is now known as the exegesis, where he was trying to come to terms and understand both the genesis of his own philosophy on life, but also his own explanation for a series of events that took place in the early 1970s to him. But clearly, to him, the idea, the reality behind the reality, the idea that there is an inner world that we exist within, and there is an outer world. And again, I know from my own research on Phil's work and his influences that he was powerfully influenced by people like Ludwig Binswanger, which again, amazing name. And Binswanger was basically the creator of existentialist psychiatry and the idea of the inner world. And Phil was very much fascinated by what he called the tomb world. And of course, again, coming back to full circle to your first comments, of course, the tomb world is I don't know if it's first mentioned in Martian Time Slip, but it's very much played upon in Martian Time Slip. And Phil from here was fascinated by pre-Socratic philosophers and also general Greek philosophers as well, and Plato's cave and such like. And he then started citing these terms, the idios cosmos and the koinos cosmos. So rather than me describe exactly what these are, I'll leave that to you, Nick, to just expand a little bit again for the individuals checking this show out as to exactly what Phil meant when he used these terms and how indeed he used examples of this in his novels.
Sure. The idios cosmos, and I think you're right, I think it was the pre-Socratics who coined these terms, or folks around that era. The idios cosmos is the private world, the inner world, the way that we perceive as being a perceiver. And the koinos cosmos is the collective, the shared world. I suppose the idios cosmos involves our senses and how they work and how we filter things. There's a great saying in the Talmud that we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. And this notion that if we go on holiday, the first thing we are on holiday with is ourselves. And when we see something, in a sense, the first thing we see is ourselves, because we are a filter. And just as the eye has its own kind of spectrum and bandwidth, and we'll speak of these a little bit more in a second, we are constraining, filtering. There is a sense in which we are all a kind of attenuator or valve which allows in certain things, and they can be to do with our upbringing, our value system, our beliefs, our passions, what is significant to us, what has meaning. And that's the idios cosmos, the private world. The koinos cosmos is the shared world. And Phil was very interested in how things like totalitarianism could be promoted by media that is shared. When people share something and believe it to be true, particularly in cases where they're unable to check the evidence for themselves. Phil thought this was very dangerous, and he always used to talk about totalitarianism was always an issue for Phil, not just with novels like The Man in the High Castle, also The Penultimate Truth, in The Mold of Yancey, the short story. He warns against the dangers of totalitarianism, but the idios and koinos are not really specifically to do with that. But the idios is the private world, and the koinos is the shared world. What I find fascinating about this, in discussing it further, is the notion that unless our idios cosmos is refined enough to perceive that which is out there, it's clear that we can't, unless it is, we can't. For example, a chimpanzee, for example, seeing Shakespeare's Hamlet in a field, and the wind blowing the pages open, the chimp will see black marks on white paper. Now, in a court of law, if we were to say, is that black marks on white paper, we would have to concede that indeed it is. As much as it being everything else, it is at first. So that's a very low level of meaning. And I tend to regard the facts of things as being on that level. People uphold facts as being the great, the great thing that we should all aspire to. But I think meaning is much higher than facts. The facts of the matter can often be banal rubble. If, for example, in a court of law, again, people would say, did you or did you not leave the old lady in the burning house when you could have saved her? And you may say, yes, but thank you, no further questions, says the prosecution. They have the facts. You left an old lady in a burning house when you could have rescued her. The reality with meaning might be that you approach the house, manage to get inside and rescue two little babies, bring them out to safety, try to get back in for the old lady, but indeed you were beaten back by the flames and were unable to save her. Did you leave an old lady in a burning house when you could have rescued her? Yes, unfortunately you did, but that fact is devoid of meaning. And I think a lot of the the legal system can operate on this level where it's about winning a case rather than finding the truth. But I must confess that I've found reductionists and fundamentalists from not just religion but science who would uphold a similar yes or no binary way of sifting reality. So if we get back to the chimp in the field for a moment, he sees Hamlet as black marks on white paper. It's because the chimp inside in his or her idios cosmos does not have a level adequate. I think Aquinas used to speak of this, used to speak of adequatio. I think that's the Latin for this thing of being adequate to that which is outside. So the chimp will read it on that level. Someone else might say at a higher level, well, it's a language. So now we know it's got a meaning, it's a language. A higher level, it's a language, it's actually the English language, Hamlet. Then eventually you get higher meaning. It's a theatrical piece written largely in iambic pentameter with 10 beats per line, and then eventually we get to the whole notion that it's a theatrical play, and it's a play about a man who's gone away to university. He's about 19. While he's away, his father dies very suspiciously, and his mum marries his uncle very, very quickly. I'm smiling because there's a great line in the play which says, which discusses how the food spread at the funeral was used later for the wedding. That's how soon they got married. It says, the funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage table, which I think is a great line. So eventually we come to a rich description of Hamlet, all of which is full of meaning, and we can perceive it because we've refined a sensibility within ourselves that is able to acquire that which is out there. We're able to relate to the outer world. So I think the idios cosmos and the koinos cosmos have a very interesting relationship in that which is out there, even if it is a hologram, and I'll say that in brackets, but that which is out there, even if it's a hologram, can only be apprehended or related to if we refine and develop an inhere. And by that, I'm not speaking of, obviously, of Shakespeare or Hamlet, although I have a passion for those. I'm using that as a currency to describe the fact that there can be levels of reading, and such that what we see will be addressing the level which we are able to assimilate. I love music, for example, and I went recently with a friend that took me to see a great concert, a Mahler symphony, and he was far more familiar with the symphony than I was. I was very moved by it, and it was incredible. But I know he got more from it because he was more well-versed in it, in not as an academic study, but as a lover of music. And so this is true for all sorts of things, that if we find a line of inquiry that gives us joy and passion, I'm all for following that as much as I possibly can. And whatever it is, and let me say, because I've mentioned classical music and Shakespeare, that I also love the designs of the original Thunderbirds, and I'm an avid reader of comic books, and I love the work of Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. I also failed my English language and literature at school, so I redid them at night school. So I don't speak with any snobbery about these things. I speak with the joy of someone making discoveries, someone finding something and enjoying it richly. But I think the key thing I'd like to express is that the idios cosmos is very important, and it's trespassed so much that little children growing up today believe that they want to be like Katie Price. And you know, any indication that someone has taken an off-the-peg life or an off-the-peg life choice, I think is almost certainly an example of the koinos cosmos, the shared world of Hello Magazine or whatever it is actually polluting the idios cosmos. So we can only see when we refine our faculties for seeing. And so the interface between the two is fascinating for me.
Yeah, because it's intriguing, this, isn't it? Because when I was at university, I did one of the courses I did was on the sociology of language, and the way in which language itself defines the way we perceive reality. And in those days, I was very much what I would call a very, very much materialist reductionist. And when I came across the idea of something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that, and in its strong version, it suggests that actually what you see is actually defined by your language. And I thought, how nonsensical. You know, what is out there is out there, and all that is happening is that light waves are actually being processed by your brain. And in my naivety, of course, in the arrogance of youth, I'd never actually thought back to the next stage to realize that what is taking place is that my brain is processing this external information and presenting to whatever it is that's inside my head, or indeed wherever I am located. Because I think one of the pertinent points you made there was the idea of where is mind located? You know, as Descartes would say, you know, it doesn't have extension in space, nor, one would argue, it probably exists in time in some way or other, but effectively, you know, it doesn't exist in any kind of physiological way that we can describe adequately. And of course, the way we see the world is therefore manipulated. You know, for instance, the idea that you know, Eskimos have 20 different words for snow. But there is a very, very interesting point put forward. I think it was by Edmund Lee Sapir when he did work with young Hopi Indians. And I think the language that Hopi Indians speak, the way the grammar works, is that a noun and the verb, the actual form of a verb, depends upon the shape of the object that it's describing. So young Hopi children, if they were exclusively speaking in whatever the language we'd call Hopi, would see the world defined by shape rather than by colour and various other things. Now, this is a very reasonable way of seeing things, you know, and I think Phil very much touched upon this and the idea that what we know defines. I mean, for instance, I agree with you totally. I mean, I'm a great lover of Mahler. I mean, I adore it. And many years ago, I went to see Mahler's Ninth, you know, and it moved me incredibly. But it moved me in a way that I couldn't really necessarily define how. And of course, this comes down to the whole idea of music, you know, the idea that and it's very pertinent here, that we hear music. And I think Phil mentions this I know he does, he mentions this in the exegesis. The idea that we hear a continual tune, whereas the brain is processing individual notes. So what we do is we smear the information to give ourselves a tune, whereas they should just be individual notes that just should strike out as individual notes. So already the brain is processing the external reality we see. Again, you know, touching upon Phil's ideas of this, I'm reminded of Phil's preoccupation with the work of Wilder Penfield. And although he's never explicit in his novels about Penfield, he has the Penfield mood organ in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? You know, the idea that you can log into something and your mood can be changed in such a way that you will see the world in a different way. And I think this was the power of Phil, wasn't it? It was the way in which he read extensively. So therefore he'd read something in New Scientist, or he'd read about what Roger Sperry was doing with split brain operations, and he would then place this in his novels. And that's what made him so powerful. And indeed, one of the things, again, I'd like to formally thank you, Nick, for the fantastic assistance you gave me in the writing of my recent Philip K. Dick. I wouldn't necessarily call it a biography as much as a synopsis of Phil's life and putting him within context, within science, and within the other influences that were on him and he'd had on other people. Because, folks, without Nick and his amazing library of Philip K. Dick books, particularly the letters and various other obscure pieces of writing on Phil, I couldn't have even started, and I do madly acknowledge that, Nick, because without you, it wouldn't have happened in the way it did. But effectively what I found there was, that his letters tell you how he was incorporating his work into his readings into his work. And it moves us nicely on, because one of the things when you and I were discussing a couple of days ago about doing this interview, the one thing that I think is very important is for you to tell us a little bit about your own book on King Lear, which you've recently published. And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how you can weave in the Philip K. Dick world to the world of Shakespeare and Lear. And particularly because, if I'm right in understanding this, you've actually taken literally every verse from Lear and analysed it and put it in historical and linguistic context, which sounds a fantastic piece of work. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about this and bounce on from there into how that fills in with Phil's work, as it were.
I will indeed. Thank you, Tony. Well, as far as King Lear goes, one reason I wanted to analyse it and break it down is that it's a play I've had a deep passion for since 1979. That was when I first read it. I just started a degree course in graphic design, and I had a great friend there called Brendan Catney. And Brendan's an Irish lad, same age as me, but I always say we were the same age, but he was older. And he said to me one day, he said, "Nick, have you read King Lear?" And I said, "No." He said, "You want to read it, you'd love it." So that weekend I read King Lear, and my mind was blown. It was the closest Shakespeare to Lewis Carroll there ever could be. And since then, every year, I've just read King Lear every year since 1979 because of my love of the text. Not only is the language scintillating and the poetry staggering. I mean, one thing Shakespeare does, which I think is amazing, is come up with these incredible metaphors which give you a new way of seeing the world. Again, that goes back to sharpening the idios cosmos, the inner world. Sometimes someone gives you a new way of looking at the world just because they're able to give you a new language about the thing. It's what you were just referring to a moment ago, how language embodies and shapes that which we see, and to some extent that which we can see. And Shakespeare seemed to be worthy of study in that way. The other thing is that I think any Shakespeare play, the speed of thought within any Shakespeare play is far too fast for any human being to actually comfort to most people, because I've been to plays where I'm so busy processing what the last character just said that I've missed what the next character says. And so I thought this is worthy of study and it's worthy of putting down. Equally, I'd seen so many productions of Lear which cut across the grain of the text and clearly had no real concept of what the characters were like or a big picture. So I wanted to write a study about it in that way. And then that was consolidated further when in the local Liverpool paper, I shall not name, dismissed the production they dismissed King Lear itself as a medieval irrelevancy. It's set in pre-Christian Britain, and the reviewer, who was a stalwart on this particular paper, dismissed it as suspicious nonsense, superstitious nonsense. But in looking at Lear, there's lots of things that connect with Philip K. Dick. The play opens with a king who's about to divide his kingdom to his three daughters and their husbands. The third daughter, Cordelia's, about to find a husband. But he's about to divide his kingdom according to who says they love him the most. So it's very fairy tale and flimsy in that kind of construct. And it begins with two characters discussing this division of the kingdom. And one says to the other, I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Albany than Cornwall. So he's suggesting that he thought that the king liked Albany much more than Cornwall and was therefore going to give him a bigger share. And the next character said, it did always seem so to us. And the whole play deals with this notion of what is and what seems to be the case. And again, it goes back to idios kosmos and koinos kosmos. How do we see the world and how is it actually? And are there any differences there? It's a play about fakes. It speaks of very contemporary things. It speaks of spin and the art of rhetoric, and it calls spin that glib and oily art to speak and purpose not. Again, it's pretending something is out there or that one is a certain way when one is quite different. It also relates to the five senses in the sense that Lear's journey is very much one of a king who becomes a man. A person who has been hiding behind his robes. He says, robes and furred gowns hide all. And in his hiding, he's never really discovered who he is or developed a rich life. In many ways, he's been a king to his daughters when he should have been a father. And he's treated so appallingly and upset. He also behaves badly too, without doubt. He says some terrible things to his daughters. But in his emotional upset and the realization of the wrong he's done and the wrong that has been done to him, as is often the case, deep emotional upset has led to a mental imbalance. And Lear, we would say, has a breakdown. In some senses, he actually goes mad. And there's an incredible poignant scene in Act 4, Scene 6, when the mad Lear, and Lear is very unhinged at this point, he meets another guy who's unfortunately been blinded deliberately and maliciously. So Gloucester is blind and Lear is mad. And the language they speak, the dialogue, is amongst the most haunting in the whole of literature. But what may interest us, I think, in relation to the conversation we've just been having, is that the deep irony, perhaps the grim irony, and there is comedy in Lear too, is that the mad Lear understands far more about the world around him than the sane Lear ever did. And the blind Gloucester actually says that he can see better now. Now he has no eyes. Indeed, he says, I stumbled when I saw. So he feels himself to be more perceptive. And there are things he did get wrong when he was blind that he's actually got right. Things he got wrong when he was sighted that he's now got right now that he's blind. So there's a lot there, and again that might relate to adequatio and levels within us, about us being adequate to the perception that we need to have. That is a necessary requirement in order to get a richer sense. I don't know that we ever see all, but a richer sense of that which is out there. The comedy I mentioned, there is great comedy in Lear too. When he's mad, Gloucester, who's blind, is trying to weep because he's just so upset about the king being reduced to this mad person, and he obviously bemoans his own tragic situation. And Lear says, if thou wilt weep, take my eyes, he says to him, which is a totally absurd idea, and there's grim comedy there as well. And then he counsels Gloucester not to weep. He says, when we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools. Now, the idea that a newborn infant's cries are related to its disappointment with the kind of people who are currently populating the earth is a brilliant line. Of course, it's tragic. And Lear, I usually I'm in tears by the end of Act 5, Scene 3, the very end. It's incredibly moving. In many ways, it's very operatic. But I would also say that Lear's misrepresented by the blow winds and crack your cheeks in the storm cliche. Lear is really about social justice. It's about perception. It's about what it means to be homeless, and it's about the effects that we have on one another as human beings moving through this life. And there are those in Lear who prosper in the short term, who do bad things to others, and so this was a difficulty, by the way, in Shakespeare's day, because the actual story of King Lear is a very old one and well known. It was mentioned in the Hollinshead Chronicles and even before. It was spelled Leir instead of Lear, but it was well known. And in the well known one, there's a happy ending where the significant death at the end. I won't say who it is because, like the Titanic, I don't want to spoil the film for you if you don't know what happens in the end. But in King Lear, what happened is that it was only performed for a short while, and then a Puritan known as Nahum Tate rewrote the play using Shakespeare's language, but rewrote it with a happy ending. And this was performed for over 150 years. So if you lived at that time, you wouldn't see the Shakespeare's Lear. I love Lear. I think it's difficult, and I think the ending is difficult too, because bad things happen to good people. But with the with the difficult ending, we are left to discuss and explore the problems of life and living. They're not tidied away in some neat, glib, saccharine or twee manner. And I admire Shakespeare for that, because it is richer, and it's not done in any gratuitous fashion. But it's been a rich journey, and yes, I've annotated every single paragraph in the whole play, so that my aim is to help people to enjoy it, really. That's the main thing. It was always seen as something for other people, certainly not for a working class lad from Anfield. I do live on the Wirral, and I've been a Wirralian for over 25 years now, since we got married. But I grew up in Anfield in a very working class situation, and my parents were good, and they loved me, and they were kind, and it was a house with books, and I was grateful for that. But certainly, if I try and share King Lear with any of my old schoolmates, it'd be very hard to get a look in, which is a shame, because it's for them, and they would enjoy it if they got into the language,
I think the point you're making is quite an interesting one, isn't it? In the sense, going back to the Mahler performance, and the idea that when you know something well, you see the richness of it in a greater way. And Shakespeare, I did Shakespeare, I can't remember now, Winter's Tale, and possibly, I acted in Twelfth Night, I think. I can't remember even the other play that I actually did for A-levels, which is a terrible admission, isn't it? But effectively, I think Shakespeare is somebody that you probably only appreciate as you get older, and you start to see that he deals with life. And when you're a teenager, you don't know life. You can never get into the mindset of Lear, not only because of the distance in time, but his circumstances. And effectively the same goes for Macbeth and many of the other plays, that you really can't see the viewpoint. But the one thing that amazes me is Shakespeare's absolute genius, in the sense that here is a man who effectively was a journeyman playwright, who'd been brought up in relative obscurity in Stratford-upon-Avon, and yet he had this phenomenal knowledge of ancient Greek myths and mythology and everything else, and had this amazing turn of language, that we cannot even begin to appreciate the genius of the man. And I know that I will be acquiring a copy of your book, because I want to take it on holiday with me when I go on holiday, because I really want to go through it as you've done, and really appreciate it. And then I would imagine then seeing a stage performance of Lear after reading your book, the real richness and magic will come out. Have you any intentions of doing it for any other plays, or is this a one-off, or do you think you're going to have a whole series of them now?
I'm part way through another of his plays, and I'm deliberately withholding the name because I don't want anyone to ask me about it, and I'm doing my best to not be influenced. I mean, one thing, I'll try and be brief in my answer, but one thing that was great about writing Lear is that I was just getting on with it, and, the few people who knew I was doing it would, obviously say, well, that's nice, and, look forward to it when it comes out. But once the first one is out, it becomes the difficult second album that people will ask you about that and that specific play, or they'll even read the play and try and give you a guide. And one thing I've tried to do is my main text with writing about the King Lear was from King Lear itself, in that I used the rest of the play to inform what was going on in any given moment. And if there were a few tough words that had different meanings in Elizabethan times, I would of course look them up and see what was said about them. Of course, one always builds on the shoulders of giants. It's that's true. But as much as possible, it's been a kind of virginal approach that I would be quietly relating to the play myself. And wanting to go as far as I possibly could with my understanding of it. And I'm glad I did that, because there are moments where the scholars and I might actually disagree. For example, there's one point early on in King Lear where there's a character called Kent who wants to prevent Lear from disinheriting Cordelia because she won't flatter him. And he tries to intervene, but in intervening, he knows he's crossing the king in front of everyone. So he gives this long preamble about, Shakespeare, whom I have served. I forget the language, but he says that, he's served so much. He treats like a father. He's always been kind to. He'd give his own life for. He gives this very long preface and preamble. And Lear says, the bow is bent, make from the shaft. Meaning, you've got something to say it. But if you read any study books on Lear, the ones I've read say that this is Lear, when Lear says the bow is bent, make from the shaft, this is Lear saying, if you don't shut up, I shall strike you with my arrow. I will release my arrow and get you for what you're about to say. So there are moments where I actually have my own opinion about things in that way. Well, it's all my own opinion, but sometimes my opinion is counter to what the scholars insist something is. And where that's the case, I would, you'll see from the book, I give fair representation to their point of view as well, because I am happy to accept if I'm wrong. But I wouldn't come up with a virginal and original take on it if I merely saturated myself with too much of the thought of others, And this goes back to idios cosmos, to create and yield from your original.
I'm very much reminded there of many, many years ago, a friend of mine who shall remain nameless. And he was very, very interested in analysing lyrics, song lyrics, and he was a great fan of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And the song almost cut my hair. He was convinced there's a line that says, I'm going to get down in that sunny southern weather and find a place to laugh and separate the wheat from the chaff. My friend was absolutely convinced that that's not what David Crosby sings in that line. And he actually says, I'm going to get down into that sunny southern weather and find a place to laugh and separate the wheel from the chair. And he then built up this incredibly exotic explanation as to why Crosby wrote it that way. And he said, well, you have a wheel moves and you're moving on and the wheel is moving you on. whereas a chair is static and you are staying where you are. So therefore he's looking to actually ground himself in a place, so he's going to separate the wheel from the chair. And again, you know, my friend's beauty of analysis showed that you can bring up some very, very clever lines and everything else in analysis of things, but you still need the framework of a great mind like Shakespeare to pull it together. I know that was rather a humorous aside, and it wasn't meant to be dismissive or anything. It was just, it just reminded me of when you were saying those lines. Now, in terms of how people can get hold of your book, Nick, can you tell the listeners or the viewers exactly what we will put something up on Facebook anyway, on my Facebook site, and we'll discuss this afterwards anyway. But if you can just let the readers, listeners, watchers, whatever we define those people out there, as to how they can actually acquire a copy. Nick, we've lost your sound. I don't think you're
I'm back on now. So, some people might like to mute me. I think I muted myself before, but thank you for letting me know. My book is called What Happens in Shakespeare's King Lear. And it's by Nick Buchanan, N-I-C-K, and surname B-U-C-H-A-N-A-N. If folks just do a search on Amazon, and any Amazon will do, from California to Japan, if they search on Amazon for What Happens in Shakespeare's King Lear, they will see it. It will be there. That's the cheapest way to purchase it. I think it retails at just over £16, and on Amazon it's postage free. But it is 508 pages, so it's quite a weighty tome. And if folks don't want to purchase through Amazon, it's available also through Barnes & Noble and most major retail. And you can put information up about the ISBN or whatever, if you like, on the website.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick. I mean, one of the things that our initial intention in this particular interview, that you would interview me about Philip K. Dick's work, but as we've already done this twice, we did decide that probably it was a better approach. And I think your work is just as important as mine, and I think it's important that I assist in any way I can to give you back the assistance you gave me so kindly and so freely in terms of your knowledge and your books and everything else. What I'd like to do is very, very quickly, in the final 2 or 3 minutes we've got, is for you to tell us a little bit about PKD Otako, exactly what the principle of that is, and indeed how people can actually check that out, because your graphic designs on PKD Otako are absolutely wonderful, and I know everybody who is involved in that particular fanzine just waxes lyrical about your graphic abilities. Your graphic ability sounds terrible, doesn't it? But effectively, if you can tell everybody a little bit about PKD Otako and exactly what it is, where they can find it, and just a little bit of background information for the final 2 or 3 minutes.
Certainly. PKD Otaku is a fan magazine that explores and discusses the ideas of Philip K. Dick. It was started by a really nice guy called Patrick Clark, who lives out in the States, and supported by a few of his friends, including Dave Hyde and Frank Bertrand, Jamie Morgan, John Fairchild. And I was invited to write something for Otaku, and was keen to do so. And when I looked at the issues that existed, the graphic layout and design was so humble as to be a little off-putting. And although the information was great in there and the content, there's some lovely pieces written by those people, it hurt my graphic design sensibilities to want to put a piece of writing in that form. However that sounds, that's how it was. Such is my desire for good graphics. There's always a joke that if you want to hire a graphic designer, just send them something written in Comic Sans. and they get very upset. And I think I'm probably one of those. So I offered to help with the layout and design, and I think that was with issue 23 I got involved. And then from then onward, in fact, Tony, I think you had something in issue 23, and then something in 25, I think, unless I'm mistaken.
It was definitely 25 was the interview you did with me. I definitely know that. There might be something in 23, but 25 has the interview, doesn't it? The interview we did outside the Bridge Inn before a meeting of the Walker Group in three-dimensional reality, consensual reality.
Absolutely. It was 25, you're right, the first one that your interview was in. And then I think there was another one later on, maybe 29 or something like that. And so it was my joy, really, to try and give what I could to help. After all, everybody working on Otaku was given their own free time and gets nothing for it except the joy of sharing ideas with other human beings. And Phil is the springboard for that. There's so many rich and diverse avenues that he encourages us to speculate about, that having a platform where these things could be put down in writing and kept as downloads. I think it comes out roughly quarterly at the moment. And I think that it looks very healthy, and it looks like it's going to continue in that way. I'll continue to give my time on it as much as I can. But I'll obviously have to do other graphic design work too to keep the wool from the door. But it looks healthy, and it's made by fans for fans. And it really is a very democratic, non-hierarchical, open kind of platform. So much so, if people want to submit artwork, if people want to submit pieces of writing, letters of comments, it's very open. It's one of the saddest things I must say about PKD Otaku is that there is so little feedback from people who obviously enjoy it and would be very sorry to see it go. But I must say as well, I'm not the editor or the originator. I'm a happy member of the band who put it together each month, but without the writers and the artists, there's nothing to put together. So kudos goes to those good folk. If people want to download any free copies, they can go to the website that is called Philip K. Dick Fans. That's all one word, philipkdickfans.com. And when they go on that particular website, which is run brilliantly by Michael Fisher, he's the official kind of house for Otaku now, and he uploads it each time there's a new one out. If folks go there and have a look at the tab for resources and fanzines, they'll see every back issue of PKD Otaku, including the 2 interviews with you, Tony, which I think were in issue 23. And it could be 28 or 29. I'm on the spot now, so I'm not sure. But they're all there for folks to download anyway.
Right, thank you very much, Nick, for a fascinating discussion, and I think that we'll have you back at some time in the future to talk a little bit more about Lear, I think. If anybody is out there is interested in just the general discussion that Nick and I had here, I really, really strongly suggest that you check out on Facebook the ITLAD Walker Group. That's ITLAD Walker Group. Myself and Nick and probably about 500 or 600 others from across the world are involved in that group now, and this is very typical of the type of things we discuss. You know, it's not to do with my work. My work is irrelevant. This is to do with understanding our relationship with reality and what reality really is in an open and reasoned and reasonable way. So please do check that out as well. Now, just to let you know that the next show will be going out on Sunday the 9th of February when we have, my guest will be Dr. Penny Satori. Penny Satori is one of the world's leading researchers in the near-death experience, and in fact she's an expert on veridical NDEs. That is NDEs where individuals have been at or near death. When they've come back, they've actually described seeing things that was impossible for them to see. This is going to be an unmissable show. Penny is world famous. She's on one or two movies I know that she's actually been an advisor to. So in which case, and she's a lovely lady as well, so it's well worth listening into. So please join us again at the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour on Sunday. Join us again for the recording, which will be recorded on the 9th of February. And as usual, my grateful thanks to the lady who makes this happen, the lady in the background, Dia Nunez, who's actually based over there in Denver in Colorado, because without Dia this would not happen. In exactly the same way that I could not have done the Philip K. Dick book without the help of Nick, I also cannot in any shape or form do this show without the continuing support of Dia Nunez. So do check out Dia's site as well. Also check out, when this is uploaded, you'll also see a lot of other videos and interviews that Dia does with other individuals as well on her H2O network. Very much worth checking out. Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys in a month's time. Thank you, and see you again. Bye-bye.